rectify or replace, and assembly engine and transmission.
Hello viewers, at the end of this exercise, you will know how to identify engine parts, dismantle various engine components, list out the precautions to be followed while overhauling an engine, check the engine parts using proper instruments or gauge, assemble the engine parts using proper tools, and clean the engine component.
Dismantling the engine. Park the vehicle on a flat surface rigidly by keeping the vehicle on the centered stand. Close the fuel tap. Remove the carburetor by loosening the air filter hose using suitable screwdriver and inlet manifold connection using suitable DE spanner. Dismantle the chain from the sprocket using suitable plier or snip tool. Also remove the clutch cable by loosening the lock nut. Drain the engine oil by loosening the drain nut or plug. Clean the cylinder block with a clean cloth. Remove the spark plug from the cylinder head using a plug spanner. Dismantle the cylinder head from the crankcase by loosening the bolts provided on the cylinder head. Remove the cylinder head gaskets and bushes and keep it in a safe, clean place. Take out the cotters, locks, collets using the special tool. Remove the intake and exhaust valve along with the valve seating and spring. camshaft by removing the timing gear from the crankshaft. Care should be taken not to change the timing or damage identification marks. Loosen the connecting rod bolts from the big end of the crankshaft using suitable DE spanner. Remove the brass bushes from the connecting rod by loosening the dowel pins. Using a wooden mallet, remove the piston pin by gently tapping on the pin and dismantle piston from the connecting rod. Remove the piston ring from the piston. Separate the crankshaft gear from the countershaft gear. Dismantle, clean and check the transmission separately. Remove the crankshaft using suitable DE spanner and also the bearings using suitable pullers. Remove the flywheel securing bolts from the crankshaft using suitable DE spanner and dismantle the flywheel. Cleaning. Clean the piston pins with kerosene. Clean the piston head thoroughly, removing the carbon and other deposits formed on it. Clean the inlet and exhaust valves. Also clean the valve springs and seating. Clean the big and small ends of the connecting rod with kerosene. Clean the crankshaft with recommended solvent, removing any carbon, oil deposits with wire brush. Clean the various bolts and nuts fitted on the cylinder head and crankcase thoroughly. Clean the cylinder walls thoroughly. Check engine components inspection. Inspect the parent bore of the cylinder for inline alignment using line boring bar and straight edge. Measure the main bearing parent bore using bore dial gauge for taper and ovality. Measure the cylinder bore diameter for wear, taper and ovality. Check the warpage of the flywheel friction surface by using a straight edge. If the warpage is more than recommended, then the flywheel should be reground. Check the face of the flywheel with the help of a dial indicator. Check the flywheel teeth for breakage or pitting. Check the valves, valve spring, and valve seating for any pitting or crack. Check the piston, connecting rod and the piston pin. Inspect the flywheel crankshaft, camshaft and timing gears, sprocket and chain. Measure the clearance between the crankshaft main journal and bearing shell. Check out the run out of journals with a dial indicator. Measure the camshaft journal for ovality taper and wear. Check for any bending of the crankshaft. Check the cylinder walls and liner for any crack or pitting. Assemble. Clean the bore of the cylinder and place the main bearing. Install the crankshaft rear bearing seal, oil seal. Install the thrust washers to the respective bearings. Place the crankshaft in its position in the cylinder. Place the shell bearing into the respective bearing caps. Check the bearing liners, shells for spread. The insert should snap into position in the housing cap. Tighten the bolts of the bearing cap to specified torque using torque wrench and check the crankshaft for free rotation. Fit the ring gear on the flywheel. Align the flywheel dowel pins with dowel pins on the flange. Assemble the valve, valve guidance, valve spring and the seating. Fix the spark plug and tighten using torque wrench to specified torque. Fit the camshaft by sliding it through the camshaft bearings. Align the timing gear of the camshaft with the crankshaft gear. Fit the compression and oil rings to the piston. Assemble the piston pin, piston and connecting rod. Fit the cylinder head using the bolts and tighten the bolts using torque wrench to specified torque. Fit the cylinder head using the bolts and tighten the bolts using torque wrench to specified torque. Fix the spark plug and tighten using torque wrench to specified torque. Fill the crankcase with recommended lube oil. Attach the carburetor, battery and various other cable linkages like choke, throttle, etc. Start the engine and check for any unwanted noise or sound. Take suitable corrective action if any. Overhauling of transmission. Dismantling. Dismantle the transmission from the engine using suitable tools, D-spanner, puller and plier, etc. Loosen the clutch cable. Remove the crankcase cover and dismantle the clutch housing. Mark the pressure plates and clutch covers position with respect to each other. Using a clutch puller, remove the pressure and clutch plates. Cleaning and checking. Wash the flywheel, ring gear and pressure plate using kerosene. Also inspect for any cracks and burnt spots. Clean the clutch linkages, eccentric pin and bush, withdrawal plate and clutch finger brackets. Visually inspect them for any damage or cracks. Also inspect the withdrawal bearing and thrust pad. Check the free length and tension of the pressure springs. Replace the springs which do not conform with manufacturer's specification. Check the clutch plate's torsion spring visually for any damage after cleaning it with kerosene. Replace the clutch plate if the torsion spring is damaged. Assembly. Place the clutch finger's bush in the clutch finger. Fit the clutch finger bracket on the clutch cover and fit the clutch finger with the bracket with the eccentric pin. Hand tighten the mounting set screws of the clutch bracket. Place the pressure plate on the clutch jig. Place the pressure springs on the spring recess of the pressure plate. Align marks of the clutch cover and pressure plate. And place the clutch cover on the pressure plate. Compress the springs with a clutch jig. Place the pressure pad on the pressure plate and tighten the pad's mounting set screws. Release the load from the springs and remove the clutch cover assembly from the clutch jig. Place the withdrawal plate on the clutch finger. Place the withdrawal plate's retaining plate on the clutch and tighten the mounting set screws of the withdrawal plate. Check the clutch engage and disengage.
Hello viewers, you have learned how to identify the parts of the engine, dismantle various components in an engine, list out the precautions to be followed while overhauling an engine, check engine parts using instruments or gauges, assemble the engine using proper tools, and clean the engine component.
Exercise 13.09 Overhaul brake and suspension system. Hello viewers, at the end of this exercise, you shall be able to dismantle the drum brake components, replace components and brake lining, check the actuation of the brakes, dismantle the shock absorber, identify the components of the shock absorber, overhaul the shock absorber. Overhauling drum type brake. Drum type brake. Place the vehicle on a flat, rigid surface using the center stand. Loosen the wheel nuts using suitable DE spanner. Loosen the brake lever by loosening the lock nut with the help of a suitable DE spanner. Loosen the brake shoe securing stem using a DE spanner. Remove the brake shoe and check the wear of the brake lining. If the lining is worn out, replace the lining with a new one. New brake shoes with company-fitted brake lining are readily available at authorized service centers. Check the fulcrum, actuating cam, and counter springs. Check for any impression or rubbing of the brake shoe on the brake drum. Clean the brake shoe thoroughly with emery paper. Clean the brake drum also with emery paper and blow off any dust and rub grinding stone over the brake drum for gripping action. Assemble the brake shoe to the brake drum and position it. Fit the wheel to the vehicle and secure it using the wheel nuts using DE spanner. Tighten the brake lever and the brake shoe securing stem. Take a road test and check the effectiveness of the new brake lining. Adjust the brake ply as per requirement. Overhauling of suspension system. Overhauling of shock absorber. According to the manufacturer, the shock absorbers are not supposed to be overhauled but may be reconditioned. Remove the shock absorber by loosening the bolts attached to the frame using suitable DE spanner. Visually examine them for any crack or damage. You may also use a magnifying lens to check for any miniature crack. Dismantle the cylinder. Remove the spring. Check the spring visually and test the spring in the compression testing machine. And take out the oil seals and drain the oil. Note down the condition of the oil. Fit new oil seals. And fill the cylinder with recommended grade, viscosity, hydraulic oil, and assemble the shock absorber. Test the shock absorber for shock absorbing capability. Fit the shock absorber on the vehicle and lighten the bolts to the required torque using torque wrench. Modern day shock absorbers are sometimes filled with a gas for better damping characteristics. Overhauling the gas-filled shock absorbers are similar to that of the hydraulic type, except for filling it with gas rather than oil. Normal overhauling or reconditioning period for shock absorbers, 2 or 3-wheeler, is 20,000 kilometers. Overhauling of front fork. Place the vehicle on the center stand rigidly on a flat surface. Using suitable DE spanner, remove the lock nuts of the fork and also the steering system so that the fork can be taken out. Remove the fork. Dismantle and check the condition of the fork. Clean the fork thoroughly with a soft cloth and check for any bend or wear and tear. Replace the fork and tighten the lock nuts using a torque wrench using recommended value torque as specified in the service manual. Test the fork for shock absorbing action by taking a test ride. In this exercise, you have learned to dismantle the drum brake components, replace components and brake lining, check the actuation of the brakes, dismantle the shock absorber, identify the components of the shock absorber, overhaul the shock absorber. Exercise 13.11. Dismantle wheel bearing, steering stem and ball race. Inspect and assemble. Hello viewers, at the end of this exercise, you shall be able to dismantle the wheel bearing, check the wheel bearing, replace the wheel bearing, dismantle the steering stem, inspect the ball bearing, list out the parts of the steering stem, adjust the steering stem. Dismantling the wheel bearing. Secure the vehicle on a flat, rigid floor. Loosen the brake by loosening the brake lock nut. Remove the wheel using DE spanner. Remove the wheel, remove the brake shoe and pull out the bearing shield. Remove the ball bearing using suitable plier or puller. Clean the bearing thoroughly with kerosene and allow it to dry. Care should be taken not to dry the bearing with compressed air, as the air may contain moisture which is harmful to the bearing. Test the bearing manually by rolling and check for any noise play. Lubricate the bearing with recommended grease and once again check for any noise or distortion. If noise still persists, it indicates that the balls have worn out and the bearing is to be replaced. Inspect and assemble steering stem. Remove the front yoke assembly by loosening the lock nut with a suitable wrench. Remove the fork securing bolts with a wrench. Remove the top and bottom ball race bushes and steel balls. Check the bearing for any distortion, noise. Clean the bearing thoroughly with kerosene and wipe it with a clean dry cloth. Add recommended quality grease and fit the bearing to the yoke assembly. Check for the vertical play and accordingly tighten the steering stem lock nut. Tilt the handlebar on both sides and ensure that the movement on both sides is free. Take a test drive and ensure that the steering is freely swinging without any restriction. In this exercise, you have learned to dismantle the wheel bearing, check the wheel bearing, replace the wheel bearing, dismantle the steering stem, inspect the ball bearing, list out parts of the steering stem, adjust the steering stem. Exercise 13.12. Dismantle, clean, check, repair and assemble starter motor and starting system. Hello viewers, at the end of this exercise, you shall be able to identify the components of the starter motor, dismantle the starter motor, check the parts of the starter motor, state the type of the starting system, test the starting system under various conditions, repair armature and coil of the starter motor. Dismantling the starter motor. Disconnect the negative lead at the battery. Disconnect the magnetic switch lead wires and the battery cable from the starting motor terminals. Remove the two mounting bolts. Remove the starter motor. Removal of the magnetic switch assembly. Remove the cable terminal nut and disconnect the lead wires from the magnetic switch. Remove the two mounting nuts and then take out the magnetic switch by slight tilting as shown. Dismantling of the motor assembly. Remove the through bolts. Take off the commutator end housing. Remove the brush holder cover from the brush holder. Take out the brush spring and brush. Remove the yoke assembly. Remove the armature along with pinion drive lever. Insert the screwdriver tip in the gap between the two stop collars and push the front collar outward. Use a 14 mm socket. Push the rear stop collar downwards. Pull out the rear pinion stop collar and overrunning clutch. Inspection. Magnetic switch. Inspect the magnetic switch boot for breakage. Inspect the plunger for wear or damage. Replace if necessary. Push the plunger in and release it. The plunger should return quickly to its original position. Replace it if necessary. Check for continuity across the magnetic switch's terminal and coil case. If continuity does not exist, the coil is open and should be replaced. Check for continuity across magnetic switch terminal 1 and terminal 3. If no continuity exists, the coil is open and should be replaced. Armature for ground. Using ohmmeter test for continuity between the commutator and armature core, the ohmmeter will indicate infinite resistance if the insulation is in sound condition. Open circuit. Check for continuity between each pair of adjacent commutator segments using an ohmmeter. If there is any discontinuity, the ohmmeter needle will not deflect. Replace the armature assembly. Commutator run out. Place the armature between two V blocks. Using a dial gauge, check the commutator for runout by slowly rotating it by hand. Correct it on lathe if required. Commutator diameters. Check for wear and replace the armature if the diameter is below limit. Commutator surface. Clean the surface by using 400 emery cloth. Check the mica depth to a minimum of 0.2 mm and correct by using a hacksaw blade or knife if required. Check field coil. Using an ohmmeter, check for continuity between the field coil and the insulated brush. If continuity is not indicated, the insulation has failed. Replace the insulation between the brush and yoke. Brush. Measure the length of the brushes. If brushes are worn down to the service limit, replace them. Brush spring. Check the brush spring for tension, rust or breakage. Overrunning clutch. Inspect the one-way clutch for free rotation in direction A and locked up the other way round. Check the pinion for abnormal wear and replace it as assembly if required. Armature shaft and drive end cover bush. Using a 10 mm rod, take out the bush cap. Measure the internal diameter of the drive bush. Measure the outer diameter of the armature shaft at the drive end. If clearance exceeds the limit, replace the bush. Assembly. Apply grease and install the overrunning clutch to the armature shaft. Insert the rear stop collar in the armature shaft. Insert a snap ring in the armature shaft. Insert the front stop collar in the armature shaft. Apply grease to the drive lever. Combine it with armature. Assemble them with a drive housing. Install the yoke. Install the brush holder. Install the 4 sets of brushes with the springs. Install the brush holder cover. Apply grease and install the commutator end housing as shown. Replace the magnetic switch and its boot with a new one if required. Fasten the switch assembly with nuts. Connect the lead wire. Performance test. Pull-in test. Connect the test leads as shown. Check the pinion overrunning clutch jumps out. If it does not, replace it. Before testing, disconnect the field coil lead from the terminal. Hold in test. While connecting as shown before with the pinion out, disconnect the negative lead from terminal C. Check that the pinion remains out. If not, replace the magnetic switch. Pinion return test. Disconnect the negative lead. Check to make sure that the pinion returns inward quickly. No load performance test. Connect the test leads as shown. Check the motor runs without fail with the pinion moved out. Remounting. Connect the battery cable and magnetic switch lead wires to the starter motor terminals. Place the starter motor in its position. Tighten the two mounting bolts. Connect the negative lead to the battery. In this exercise, you have learned to identify the parts of the starter motor, dismantle the starter motor, check the components of the starter motor, state the types of starting system, testing the types of starting system under various conditions, repair armature and coil of a starter motor. Exercise 13.13. Check and repair charging system components. Hello viewers, at the end of this exercise, you shall be able to list out the components of a charging system, dismantle a charging system, test the components of a charging system, identify faults in the charging system, replace the components in the charging system. The charging system consists of a rectifier unit which takes in voltage from the magneto and converts it into a DC, which is then fed to the battery through a diode through a fuse. The charging system. Remove the battery connections and loosen the positive and negative leads. Remove the fuse and the fuse wire and the coil coming out from the rectifier. Dismantle the rectifier unit by loosening the securing screws using a suitable screwdriver. Check the rectifier by allowing AC and check whether the output is unidirectional AC. If not, change the rectifier. The rectifier unit consists of diodes. Check the diodes for proper current flow direction. Check the voltage regulator for proper functioning. It should open the charging circuit when the magneto develops high voltage. Check whether the battery fuse is working properly. If not, replace the fuse. The modern charging system comes out as an electronic pack and it can only be checked but cannot be repaired. So, if there is any problem with the charging system, it has to be replaced. Battery drain test. Disconnect the negative battery terminal. Connect a 12 volts test lamp between the cable clamp and battery terminal. Ensure that every other loads are turned off. If the bulb glows, then there is a drain. Remove all the fuses one by one until the bulb is switched off. Locate the circuit and take necessary corrective action. No load voltage test. With no electrical load turned on, check the battery voltage. This is the base voltage. Now start the engine and keep the engine at 1500 RPM. With no load other than ignition, the voltage should go up by not more than 2 volts above the base voltage. If the voltage goes up more than 2 volts, then perform an overvoltage test. Overvoltage test. Connect a jumper wire between the regulator base and magneto frame. Repeat the load test. If the overvoltage condition disappears, there is a bad circuit between the regulator and magneto. Clean the ground connections at the regulator and battery. If the overvoltage condition still exists, disconnect the regulator wiring plug from the regulator and repeat no load test. If the overvoltage condition disappears, voltmeter reads base voltage, the regulator is defective. Replace it. If overvoltage condition still persists with regulator wiring plug disconnected, then there is a short in the wiring harness between the magneto and regulator. In this exercise, you have learned to list out the components of a charging system, dismantle the charging system, test the components of the charging system, identify faults in the charging system, replace components in the charging system. Exercise 13.14. Check voltage, continuity and resistance in electrical systems. Rectify defects in lighting systems. Hello viewers, at the end of this exercise, you shall be able to list out instruments used to measure voltage, current and resistance, use multimeter for testing the continuity in the circuits, use ohmmeter to find the resistance in the circuits, use ammeter and aviometer to measure voltage, current and resistance in the circuits, detect and rectify the fault in lighting system circuit. Checking ignition system. Check the battery terminals and tighten them if they are loose. Using a AVO meter multimeter in 12 voltage range, connect the positive terminals of the battery and a meter input lead to check continuity. Check continuity between ammeter and ignition key and the ignition coil, magneto coil, ignition coil and distributor cap motor. Distributor outer terminal and each spark plug. There will be no distributor in motorcycles, mopeds. The spark plug will be directly connected to the HT lead to the secondary coil. If there is any discontinuity between any of the shown circuit, the multimeter will show very high, infinite resistance, indicating broken or loose connection between points. Sometimes the wires may be broken or torn, which may lead to discontinuity. If there is any open circuit replace the defective leads. Also, tighten any loose connections. Checking voltage in the coil ignition circuit magneto assembly. Check the connectivity between battery and CDI capacitor ignition circuit unit using a multimeter and check for any faults like discontinuity, open connections. Check the connectivity between voltage regulator, charging rectifier and diode system and the battery. Ensure that the battery is not overchanged or underchanged. Check the resistance between voltage regulator and magneto assembly using a correct range of ohm meter. If the test lamp lights or ohm meter reading is almost zero, then the circuit is grounded. Rectify it. Using a digital multimeter DMM, check the continuity for each wiring circuit like horn, headlight, tail lamp, brake light switch circuit, etc. and take suitable corrective action. If the bulb filament is worn out, replace the bulb in the respective circuit. If the bulb is working well, then check for any discontinuity or short in the circuit and rectify it. Owner's manual, service manual of any two-wheelers will contain the detailed wiring circuit or diagram. Refer the diagram and carry out the electrical checks. Lighting system circuit and fault finding procedure. The lighting system provides illumination on the road to ensure good visibility for the driver, safety to the vehicle and the vehicle coming on the opposite direction, and also as a safety device for the following vehicles: the headlamp, tail lamp, brake light, turn signal lights, flasher, speedometer console light and warning light constitute the lighting system. The lighting system consists of switches, lamps, wiring harness and fuse. Fault finding procedure in lighting system circuit. The lighting system circuit of moped is as shown. Check each circuit: headlamp, brake light, tail lamp, turn signal indicator and speedometer console for continuity using a digital multimeter. Check for worn out bulbs, tail lamp, headlight, turn signal indicator, speedometer console light. If the bulb is fused, then replace it with a new one of the same specification. Care should be taken while handling replacing halogen bulbs. They should not be touched by hands. It may explode as it contains gas. If the bulb is in good condition, then check for any loose wiring connections or pin or socket. Tighten them. Check for any short in wiring. If found any, replace it and suitably wind insulation tape over the wire. In this exercise, you have learned to list out the instruments used to measure voltage, current and resistance. Use multimeter testing the continuity in the circuit. Use ohm meter to find the resistance in the circuits. Use ammeter and aviometer to measure the voltage, current and resistance in the circuits. Detect and rectify the fault in lighting system circuits.
Today we will discuss about chemical